Robert Williams had dreamed of this moment for 30 years. Standing in front of his new ranch-style home in Pine Valley Estates, he felt like he'd finally made it. The house sat on a corner lot with a beautiful lawn that stretched back to a small pond. After 3 decades of working double shifts as a construction supervisor, saving every penny he could, this place was his reward. The neighborhood looked perfect. Clean streets, well-maintained homes, and friendly neighbors who waved when they drove by. Robert had chosen this community because it felt safe and welcoming. The real estate agent had told him about the homeowners association that kept everything looking nice. That sounded good to Robert. He wanted his property value to stay high. For the first few months, everything went smoothly. Robert spent his weekends fixing up the house and getting to know his neighbors. Mrs. Chen next door brought him homemade cookies. The family across the street helped him move his furniture in. Everyone seemed genuinely happy to have him in the neighborhood. But then strange things started happening to his mailbox. It started on a Tuesday morning in September. Robert walked out to get his mail and found his mailbox lying flat on the ground. The wooden post had snapped clean in half and mail was scattered across his lawn. He figured maybe a delivery truck had backed into it by accident. These things happen, right? Robert went to the hardware store and bought a new mailbox and post. He spent his Saturday afternoon digging a new hole and setting everything up properly. The mailbox looked great, matching the style of all the others on his street. He even planted some flowers around the base to make it look extra nice. 2 weeks later, it happened again. This time, Robert noticed something odd. There were tire tracks in his grass leading right up to where his mailbox had been. The tracks showed that someone had deliberately driven off the road and into his yard. This wasn't an accident. Robert knocked on Mrs. Chen's door to ask if she'd seen anything. She looked uncomfortable and said she hadn't noticed anything unusual, but her eyes kept darting away from his and she seemed nervous. Robert got the feeling she knew more than she was saying. The third time his mailbox got destroyed, Robert decided he needed answers. He bought a small security camera from an electronics store and mounted it on his porch where it could see the mailbox clearly. The camera was motion-activated and could record in the dark. If someone was targeting his property, he was going to find out who. For 3 weeks, nothing happened. Robert started to think maybe whoever was doing this had moved on. Then, on a Thursday evening, his phone buzzed with an alert from the camera app. Someone had triggered the motion sensor. Robert pulled up the video on his phone and couldn't believe what he was seeing. A white pickup truck was driving slowly down his street. As it approached his house, the truck suddenly swerved off the road and drove straight over his mailbox. The driver didn't even slow down. He just plowed right through it and kept going. But that wasn't the worst part. Robert could clearly see 2 men in the truck and they were laughing. One of them was actually pointing at the destroyed mailbox and slapping his knee like it was the funniest thing he'd ever seen. These people were treating his property like their personal entertainment. Robert rewound the video and watched it, again, this time focusing on the truck itself. In the dim streetlight, he could make out some kind of decal or sticker on the side of the vehicle. He zoomed in as much as the camera would allow and saw letters that looked like they spelled out something about the homeowners association. His heart sank. The people destroying his mailbox weren't random vandals or teenagers causing trouble. They were connected to his own HOA. Robert spent the next day asking around the neighborhood, trying to be casual about it. He mentioned to a few neighbors that his mailbox kept getting knocked down and wondered if anyone else had the same problem. The responses he got were telling. Mr. Peterson, who lived 2 houses down, looked surprised. Really? I've had the same mailbox for 8 years and never had a problem. The woman who lived across the street said the same thing. In fact, as Robert walked around the neighborhood, he realized something that made his stomach turn. He was the only person on his street whose mailbox kept getting destroyed, and he was also the only black homeowner on his street. Robert had faced discrimination before in his life, but he'd hoped those days were behind him. He'd worked hard, saved his money, and bought his home fair and square. He followed all the neighborhood rules and kept his property looking perfect. But apparently that wasn't enough for some people. The more he thought about it, the more the pattern became clear. His mailbox had been fine for the first few months when he was just another new resident. But as word spread through the neighborhood about who he was, the problems started. Someone had decided that he didn't belong in Pine Valley Estates, and they were going to make his life difficult until he got the message. Robert felt angry, but he also felt something else: determination. He hadn't worked 30 years to own his dream home just to be bullied out of it by a couple of cowards in a pickup truck. If these people wanted to play games with his mailbox, he was going to play back. But first, he needed to know exactly who he was dealing with. The next time he replaced his mailbox, Robert made sure his security camera had a clear view and good lighting. He also set up a second camera on the other side of his porch. If those men came back, he was going to get crystal clear footage of their faces and their license plate. He didn't have to wait long. 5 days later, they returned. This time, Robert's cameras caught everything in perfect detail: the white pickup truck, the two men inside laughing and high-fiving each other, and most importantly, the HOA enforcement decal clearly visible on the truck's door. Robert also got a clear shot of the license plate in both men's faces. The driver was a heavy-set man with a beard, probably in his 40s. The passenger was younger and thinner, wearing a baseball cap. Both of them looked like they were having the time of their lives destroying someone else's property. But Robert noticed something else in the footage. As the truck drove away, it pulled into a driveway just 3 streets over. These weren't strangers coming from across town to cause trouble. These were people who lived right here in his own neighborhood. Robert sat in his living room that night, watching the video over and over again. He felt a mix of anger, disappointment, and determination. He'd worked too hard to get here to let a couple of bullies drive him away. But he also knew he needed to be smart about how he handled this. Going to the police might not help much, since this was happening on HOA property and involved HOA people. No, Robert needed a different approach. He needed to understand exactly how the HOA worked, who was in charge, and what his rights were as a homeowner. Most importantly, he needed to figure out a way to stop these attacks that wouldn't give these men any excuse to escalate their harassment. As he turned off the lights and headed to bed, Robert made himself a promise. His mailbox was going to stop being an easy target. One way or another, he was going to solve this problem permanently. Robert spent the weekend preparing for battle. He printed out screenshots from his security footage, organized them in a folder, and wrote down exactly what had happened each time his mailbox was destroyed. He wasn't going to walk into this unprepared. The Pine Valley Estates HOA held their monthly meeting on the second Tuesday of every month in the community center. Robert had never attended one before, but he'd received the notices in his mail. Usually he just threw them away. Now he wished he'd been paying attention all along. Tuesday evening came and Robert walked into the community center carrying his folder of evidence. About 20 people were scattered around the room, mostly older residents he recognized from around the neighborhood. At the front table sat 5 people who looked like they ran the show. The woman in charge was someone Robert had seen driving around the neighborhood in a silver SUV. She was probably in her 50s, with short blonde hair and the kind of stern expression that suggested she didn't like being questioned. Her nameplate read, "Linda Hartwell, President." Robert waited through 45 minutes of boring discussions about landscaping contracts and pool maintenance fees. Finally, when they opened the floor for resident concerns, he stood up. "I'd like to report a problem with HOA enforcement," Robert said, his voice carrying clearly through the small room. "Someone has been deliberately destroying my mailbox, and I have video evidence that shows it's being done by people with HOA enforcement vehicles." The room went quiet. Linda Hartwell looked annoyed, like Robert had just interrupted something important with trivial nonsense. "What's your address?" she asked, not even looking up from her papers. Robert gave his address and handed his folder to the woman sitting next to Linda. "I have security camera footage showing the same truck destroying my mailbox multiple times. The truck has HOA enforcement decals on it." Linda finally looked at the photos, flipping through them quickly. Her expression didn't change at all. "These photos are very dark and unclear," she said. "I can't really make out any details." Robert felt his temperature rising. The photos weren't perfect, but they clearly showed the truck and the decals. "Ma'am, You can see the HOA stickers on the side of the truck in several of these images. The license plate is visible too. Mr. Williams, I think you might be misunderstanding what you're seeing, Linda said in a tone that suggested she was talking to a child. Our enforcement volunteers are dedicated community members who take great pride in maintaining our neighborhood standards. They would never deliberately damage anyone's property. One of the other board members, an older man with gray hair, nodded along. Our enforcement team does excellent work. They've been keeping this neighborhood beautiful for years. Robert couldn't believe what he was hearing. He'd brought them clear evidence of their own people destroying his property, and they were acting like he was making the whole thing up. So, what you're telling me, Robert said slowly, is that even with video evidence, you're not going to do anything about this? Linda's expression hardened. Mr. Williams, I think you need to consider that new residents sometimes have difficulty adjusting to community standards. Perhaps your mailbox installations haven't been meeting our guidelines, and the enforcement team was simply doing their job. The implication hung in the air like a slap. Robert looked around the room and saw a few neighbors avoiding eye contact. Others were nodding along with Linda like she was making perfect sense. My mailbox meets every single guideline in the HOA handbook, Robert said. I've checked multiple times, and even if it didn't, that wouldn't give anyone the right to drive over it with a truck. Well, Linda said, shuffling her papers like the conversation was over. We'll look into your concerns and get back to you. Is there any other business? Robert realized he was being dismissed. When can I expect to hear back from you? We'll be in touch, Linda said without looking at him. Robert left the meeting feeling frustrated and angry. They hadn't even pretended to take his complaint seriously. Worse, Linda's comment about adjustment to community standards felt like a threat. But Robert wasn't giving up. If the HOA board wouldn't help him, he'd go to the police. The next morning, he drove to the local police station with his folder of evidence. The desk sergeant was polite but not particularly interested. This sounds like a civil matter, sir. Since it's happening on HOA property and involves HOA enforcement, you'd need to work it out with them first. But it's my property being destroyed, Robert said. My mailbox, my grass, my landscaping. How is that not a criminal matter? The sergeant shrugged. In these planned communities, the HOA has a lot of authority. Unless someone's being physically threatened, we usually let them handle their own problems. Robert left the police station feeling even more frustrated. It seemed like the system was designed to protect the people doing the harassing, not the victim. Over the next 2 weeks, Robert did his research. He spent hours online reading about HOA law, property rights, and tenant protections. What he discovered made him even angrier. The 2 men in the truck weren't just random volunteers. According to public records he found online, the driver was Dale Morrison, Linda Hartwell's son-in-law. The passenger was Rick Santos, Morrison's friend and business partner. They had been given contracts by the HOA to perform compliance enforcement throughout the neighborhood. So Linda Hartwell had sat in that meeting and lied right to his face. She knew exactly who was destroying his mailbox because one of them was married to her daughter. Robert also discovered that Pine Valley Estates had a history of complaints about selective enforcement. In the past 3 years, there had been 6 formal complaints filed with the county about discriminatory HOA practices. All of them had been dismissed due to insufficient evidence or settled quietly out of court. He was starting to understand how this worked. The HOA leadership used enforcement as a weapon against residents they didn't like. If you complained, they made your life even more difficult. If you tried to fight back, they had lawyers and resources that most individual homeowners couldn't match. But Robert also learned something encouraging. According to federal law, systematic harassment based on race was illegal, even in private communities. If he could prove that he was being targeted because of his race, he might have a case. The problem was proving it. His video evidence showed the harassment, but it didn't prove the motivation. He needed more. Robert decided to attend the next HOA meeting and try a different approach. This time, he brought a friend from work, Tony Rodriguez, who lived in a different neighborhood but had experience dealing with HOA problems. At the meeting, Robert stood up during resident concerns again. I'm here to follow up on the enforcement issue I raised last month, he said. Since then, my mailbox has been destroyed 3 more times. I'm requesting that the board take immediate action to stop this harassment. Linda Hartwell barely looked up. Mr. Williams, we investigated your claims and found no evidence of wrongdoing by our enforcement team. Perhaps you should consider that your mailbox location or installation might be the problem. This time, Tony stood up. Excuse me, ma'am, but could you explain what specific installation problems might cause someone to repeatedly drive over a mailbox? Because that seems like a strange coincidence. Linda looked irritated. And you are? I'm here as Mr. Williams's guest, Tony said. I'm just trying to understand how mailbox installation problems lead to truck damage. Our enforcement team follows very specific protocols, Linda said. If there are violations, they take appropriate action. So you're saying they're supposed to drive over mailboxes? Tony asked. The room got uncomfortable. A few people shifted in their seats, and Robert could see that some residents were starting to look skeptical about Linda's explanations. I think this conversation is getting out of hand, Linda said. Mr. Williams, if you're not satisfied with how this community is managed, perhaps you should consider whether Pine Valley Estates is the right fit for you. There it was. The threat was out in the open now. Robert looked around the room and saw that several neighbors were staring at Linda with shocked expressions. A few people were whispering to each other. After the meeting, an older woman approached Robert in the parking lot. I'm Helen Chang, she said. I live on Maple Street. I wanted you to know that what happened in there wasn't right. Thank you, Robert said. I appreciate that. Linda Hartwell has been running this HOA like her personal kingdom for years, Helen continued. Most people are too scared to speak up because they're afraid she'll find ways to make their lives difficult. But what she said to you tonight crossed a line. Helen leaned closer. If you're serious about fighting this, you should know that you're not the first person she's targeted. There have been others over the years. People who didn't fit her idea of what this neighborhood should look like. Robert felt a spark of hope. Would any of those people be willing to talk to me? Maybe, Helen said. Let me make some phone calls. As Robert drove home that night, he felt like he finally understood what he was up against. This wasn't just about his mailbox. This was about a corrupt HOA leadership that thought they could bully residents into leaving if they didn't like them. But Robert also felt something else. Determination. Linda Hartwell had just made a mistake. She'd made her threats in front of witnesses, and if Helen was right about other victims, Robert might not be fighting this battle alone. The war for his mailbox was about to become something much bigger. Robert wasn't the type to give up easily. Growing up, his father had always told him that every problem had a solution if you were willing to think hard enough and work smart enough to find it. This mailbox situation was just another engineering challenge, and Robert had been solving those his whole career. The morning after the disastrous HOA meeting, Robert sat at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a legal pad. He drew a line down the middle of the page. On the left side, he wrote problems. On the right side, he wrote solutions. The problems were clear enough. Dale Morrison and Rick Santos were going to keep destroying his mailbox no matter what the HOA board said or didn't say. The police weren't going to help because they considered it a civil matter. The HOA leadership was protecting the men doing the damage because one of them was family. But what about solutions? Robert had been thinking about this wrong. He'd been trying to stop the attacks through official channels. What if instead he made the attacks stop working? Robert had spent 25 years in construction and engineering. He understood materials, stress points, and structural integrity better than most people. His current mailbox was designed to look nice and hold mail. It wasn't designed to withstand being deliberately run over by a pickup truck. But what if it was? Robert spent the day researching mailbox regulations. He discovered that the Postal Service had very specific requirements about mailbox height, distance from the road, and accessibility. But they didn't say anything about what materials you could use or how strong the mailbox had to be. The HOA rules were similar. They specified that mailboxes had to match a certain style and color scheme, but they didn't limit the construction materials as long as the appearance was correct. That gave Robert an idea. What if he built a mailbox that looked exactly like the standard design but was actually strong enough to stop a truck? The more Robert thought about it, the more excited he got. This wasn't about revenge or hurting anyone. This was about solving the problem in a way that would make it stop permanently. If Morrison and Santos couldn't destroy his mailbox anymore, they'd probably move on to easier targets. Robert drove to his old job site and talked to his former supervisor, Carlos Martinez. Carlos had always been good about letting employees take leftover materials for personal projects, as long as they asked first. "I need some heavy-duty steel post material," Robert explained. "The kind we use for guardrail foundations." Carlos raised an eyebrow. "That's some serious hardware, Robert. What are you building?" "A mailbox that's going to last a very long time," Robert said with a smile. Carlos laughed and pointed toward the scrap pile. "Help yourself. That stuff's going to get recycled anyway." Robert loaded his truck with a steel post that was designed to anchor highway guardrails. The thing was incredibly heavy and could probably stop a full-size truck traveling at highway speed. It was definitely overkill for a mailbox, but overkill was exactly what Robert had in mind. Back at home, Robert measured his front yard carefully. He needed to make sure his new mailbox would be in exactly the same location as the old one, meeting all postal requirements. He also needed to ensure that the installation would be completely on his own property. The next challenge was making the steel post look like a normal wooden mailbox post. Robert drove to a lumber yard and bought cedar boards that matched the style used throughout the neighborhood. His plan was to build a wooden frame around the steel post that would look identical to everyone else's mailbox. But first, he needed to install the foundation properly. Robert had learned from years of construction work that if you wanted something to be permanent, you had to dig deep and use plenty of concrete. Robert spent his weekend digging a hole that was 3 feet deep and 2 feet wide. His neighbors probably thought he was crazy, putting that much effort into a mailbox installation. But Robert wanted this thing to be absolutely immovable. When he was ready to set the steel post, Robert called his friend Mike Thompson to help. Mike was a welder who owed Robert a favor from a few years back. "This is the strongest mailbox post I've ever seen," Mike said, as they lowered the steel beam into the hole. "What exactly are you expecting to hit this thing?" "Let's just say I want to be prepared for anything," Robert replied. They filled the hole with concrete and let it cure for a full week. When Robert tested the post by pushing against it with all his strength, it didn't budge even slightly. The thing was like part of the foundation of the earth. Next came the camouflage job. Robert carefully measured and cut cedar boards to create a wooden sleeve that would slide over the steel post. From the outside, it would look like a normal wooden post, but inside was enough steel to stop a tank. The mailbox itself was another challenge. Robert's previous mailboxes had been standard residential units that looked nice but weren't built for impact. This time, he wanted something that could take a hit and keep on working. After some research, Robert found a company that made mailboxes for rural areas where vandalism was a common problem. They offered models that were designed to withstand everything from baseball bats to gunshots. Robert ordered one that looked similar to the standard Pine Valley Estates design, but was actually made from heavy-gauge steel. When the mailbox arrived, Robert was impressed. The thing weighed almost 40 pounds and felt like a piece of armor. He had Mike weld it to a steel mounting plate that would distribute any impact force across the entire post. The final step was making everything look normal. Robert stained the wooden sleeve to match the other mailboxes in the neighborhood and added decorative elements that matched the HOA requirements exactly. He even planted the same flowers around the base that he'd used before. When Robert stepped back to admire his work, he smiled. His new mailbox looked exactly like all the others on his street. Unless you knew what to look for, you'd never guess that it was actually an immovable fortress disguised as a piece of suburban decoration. But Robert wasn't done yet. He also upgraded his security camera system. The single camera he'd been using had captured the previous attacks, but the footage wasn't perfect. This time, Robert installed 3 cameras with overlapping fields of view and infrared night vision. If Morrison and Santos came back, he was going to get crystal clear footage from multiple angles. Robert also did something else that showed how carefully he'd thought this through. He contacted a lawyer who specialized in property rights and homeowner issues. Robert explained the situation and asked about his legal position if someone was injured while attempting to damage his property. The lawyer's advice was clear. As long as Robert's mailbox met all postal and HOA requirements and was installed entirely on his own property, he had every right to make it as strong as he wanted. If someone chose to drive into it and got hurt, that was their own fault for attempting to destroy someone else's property. Just make sure you document everything, the lawyer advised. Keep records of all the previous damage, your complaints to the HOA and police, and your efforts to resolve the situation through proper channels. If this goes to court, you want to show that you tried to handle it the right way first. Robert also prepared for the aftermath. He knew that when Morrison and Santos hit his new mailbox, there were going to be consequences. They might get hurt. Their truck would definitely get damaged. The HOA was going to be angry. Robert needed to be ready for all of that. He made copies of all his documentation and stored them in multiple places. He had video evidence of the previous attacks, records of his complaints to the HOA and police, and proof that he'd tried to resolve the situation peacefully. He also had all the receipts and specifications for his new mailbox installation, proving that it met every requirement. 3 weeks after installing his new mailbox, Robert was ready. Every time he walked out to get his mail, he felt a little thrill of anticipation. His mailbox looked perfectly normal, but it was actually a carefully engineered trap waiting for Morrison and Santos to spring it. Robert had turned the tables completely. Instead of being the victim waiting for the next attack, he was now in control. Morrison and Santos had no idea what was coming, and when they found out, it was going to be too late. The best part was that Robert hadn't done anything wrong. He'd followed every rule, met every requirement, and stayed within his legal rights. He'd simply used his engineering skills to solve a problem that the official system wouldn't address. All he had to do now was wait. And Robert had a feeling he wouldn't have to wait very long. Robert didn't have to wait long. It was a Thursday evening just 3 weeks after he'd installed his new mailbox, when his phone buzzed with a motion alert from his security cameras. He'd been watching television in his living room, but something about the alert made him sit up straight. There was a familiar pattern to how these attacks happened, and the timing felt right. Robert opened the camera app on his phone and watched the live feed. Sure enough, a white pickup truck was driving slowly down his street. Even in the dim evening light, Robert could see the HOA enforcement decals on the side of the vehicle. Dale Morrison was behind the wheel, with Rick Santos riding shotgun, just like every time before, but this time was going to be different. Robert moved to his front window where he could see both the live action and his phone screen simultaneously. His heart was pounding, but not from fear. After months of being victimized, he was finally going to get justice. All those hours of planning and engineering were about to pay off. The truck slowed down as it approached Robert's house. Through his window, Robert could see Morrison and Santos talking and pointing at his mailbox. They were probably planning their approach, deciding how fast to go and what angle to take. They had no idea they were about to drive into the equivalent of a brick wall. Robert watched as Morrison turned the wheel and guided the truck off the road and onto Robert's lawn. The truck picked up speed as it headed straight for the mailbox. Santos was already laughing and giving Morrison encouragement. These two actually thought this was funny. The impact was everything Robert had hoped for, and more. Morrison's truck hit the disguised steel post at about 20 miles per hour. The sound was incredible, a tremendous crash of metal on metal that echoed through the neighborhood. The truck came to an immediate and violent stop, as if it had run into a mountain. The front end crumpled like an accordion. Steam poured from the radiator and both airbags deployed with explosive force. Robert's mailbox didn't move a single inch. It stood there looking perfectly normal, as if a paper airplane had bounced off it instead of a full-size pickup truck. For a moment, everything was quiet except for the hissing of the truck's damaged radiator. Then Santos started screaming. Not laughing anymore, but actually screaming in pain and panic. Morrison was slumped over the steering wheel, either unconscious or too dazed to move. Robert's first instinct was to run outside and help, but he forced himself to stay calm and think. These men had been terrorizing him for months. They'd ignored multiple warnings and opportunities to stop. They'd made their choice and now they were facing the consequences. Instead of rushing outside, Robert called 911. "I need an ambulance and police at 1247 Oak Ridge Drive," he said calmly. "There's been an accident. A truck crashed into my mailbox and the occupants appear to be injured." The 911 operator asked if Robert had witnessed the accident. "Yes," he said. "I have the whole thing on security camera." Within minutes, Robert's quiet neighborhood was filled with flashing lights. 2 ambulances, 3 police cars and a fire truck all converged on his front yard. Neighbors came out of their houses to see what was happening. Some of them were the same people who'd avoided eye contact when Robert asked about his previous mailbox problems. The paramedics worked quickly to extract Morrison and Santos from the wreckage. Santos was conscious, but clearly in pain, holding his ribs and complaining about his neck. Morrison was awake but confused, probably dealing with a concussion from hitting the steering wheel when his airbag failed to fully protect him. While the medical team worked, a police officer approached. "Robert, you're the homeowner?" the officer asked. "Yes, sir," Robert replied. "Robert Williams. I live here. Can you tell me what happened?" Robert gestured toward his front yard where the crumpled truck sat next to his perfectly intact mailbox. "Those 2 men drove off the road and crashed into my mailbox. This is actually the 7th time they've done this. I have video footage of all the previous incidents." The officer looked confused. "They've done this before?" "Many times," Robert said. "I've filed complaints with both the HOA and the police department. I have all the documentation inside if you'd like to see it." By this time, Linda Hartwell had arrived on the scene. She must have heard about the accident through whatever communication network the HOA used. She took one look at the situation and immediately started pointing fingers at Robert. "Officer, this man has created a dangerous trap," she said loudly. "He deliberately built that mailbox to hurt people." The police officer looked from Linda to Robert to the damaged truck. "Ma'am, are you saying this gentleman's mailbox is illegal?" "Well, no, but does it meet postal requirements?" Linda hesitated. "I suppose so, but HOA requirements?" "Technically, yes, but that's not the point." The officer walked over to examine Robert's mailbox more closely. He knocked on the wooden exterior, which sounded exactly like a normal wooden post. He checked the height and distance from the road with a measuring tape. Everything was exactly where it should be. "Sir," the officer said to Robert, "can I see those previous incident reports you mentioned?" Robert went inside and returned with his carefully organized folder of evidence. The officer spent several minutes reviewing the photos and videos from the previous attacks. His expression grew more serious as he realized what he was looking at. "Mr. Williams, these photos show clear evidence of deliberate property destruction," the officer said. "Why didn't the previous officers who took these reports pursue charges?" "They told me it was a civil matter since it involved the HOA," Robert explained. The officer shook his head. "Deliberate destruction of property is a criminal matter regardless of who's doing it." He looked over at Morrison and Santos, who were being loaded into ambulances. "Those 2 men are going to face charges for malicious destruction of property, multiple counts." Linda Hartwell overheard this and became even more agitated. "Officer, you don't understand. Those men work for the HOA. They were enforcing community standards." "Ma'am," the officer said firmly, "there is no community standard that allows people to drive trucks over mailboxes. If these men were doing this as part of their official duties, then the HOA is going to have some serious legal problems." By now, a small crowd of neighbors had gathered to watch the drama unfold. Robert recognized several faces from the HOA meetings. He also saw Helen Chang, the woman who had approached him in the parking lot after the last meeting. She was talking quietly to several other residents, and Robert got the feeling that word was spreading quickly about what had really been happening. A tow truck arrived to haul away Morrison's destroyed pickup. The damage was extensive. The front end was completely crushed, both headlights were shattered, and various fluids were leaking onto Robert's lawn. The truck was obviously a total loss. As the excitement died down and the emergency vehicles left, Robert found himself standing in his front yard surrounded by curious neighbors. His mailbox stood proudly among the chaos, completely undamaged and still holding his mail from that day. Helen Chang approached him with several other residents. "Robert, I owe you an apology," she said. "A lot of us suspected something like this was going on, but we were too scared to speak up. Those men have been terrorizing this neighborhood for years," added Mr. Chen from next door. "Linda Hartwell gives them free rein to harass anyone she doesn't like." "Is it true that you have video of all the previous attacks?" asked another neighbor. Robert nodded. "Every single one. Dates, times, license plates, everything." "Would you be willing to share that with the rest of us?" Helen asked. "Because I think it's time we did something about Linda Hartwell and her enforcement thugs." Robert looked around at the group of neighbors and realized that Morrison and Santos crashing into his mailbox had done more than just solve his personal problem. It had exposed the whole corrupt system that Linda Hartwell had been running. "I'll lie. Share everything I have," Robert said. "It's time this neighborhood knew the truth about what's been happening." As the crowd dispersed and Robert finally went back inside his house, he felt a sense of satisfaction he hadn't experienced in months. His engineering solution had worked perfectly. Morrison and Santos would be facing criminal charges and wouldn't be terrorizing anyone else anytime soon. Linda Hartwell's cover had been blown in front of half the neighborhood. And his mailbox? It was still standing exactly where it should be, ready to hold his mail for many years to come. The war for Robert's mailbox was over, but the battle for Pine Valley Estates was just beginning. The aftermath of the crash moved faster than Robert had expected. Within 24 hours, his story was spreading throughout Pine Valley Estates like wildfire. Neighbors who had never spoken to each other before were suddenly sharing stories about Linda Hartwell's enforcement tactics and the mysterious problems that seemed to plague residents who questioned her authority. Helen Chang called Robert the next morning with news. "I've been making phone calls all night," she said. "You're not going to believe how many people have had problems with those two men. Mrs. Patterson told me they've been parking outside her house and taking pictures because her garden gnomes supposedly violate the decoration policy. The Johnson family says Morrison once told them their teenager's car was too urban for the neighborhood." Robert wasn't surprised, but he was glad the truth was finally coming out. "Have you heard anything about what happened to Morrison and Santos?" "Santos was released from the hospital last night with bruised ribs and a neck strain," Helen reported. "Morrison is staying another day for observation because of his concussion. But here's the interesting part. Their insurance company is already asking questions about why they were driving off-road and deliberately targeting your property." That afternoon, Robert received a visit from Detective Patricia Reeves from the County Sheriff's Department. Unlike the patrol officers who had brushed off his previous complaints, Detective Reeves took the situation very seriously. "Mr. Williams, I've reviewed all of your evidence from the previous incidents," she said, sitting at Robert's kitchen table with a thick file folder. "What we have here is a clear pattern of criminal harassment. Combined with the crash yesterday, I'm confident we can pursue multiple felony charges." Robert felt a surge of satisfaction. "What kind of charges?" "Malicious destruction of property, harassment, possibly conspiracy, if we can prove the HOA leadership was directing these attacks," Detective Reeves explained. "The fact that one of the suspects is related to the HOA president makes this especially serious. We're also looking into whether this constitutes a federal civil rights violation." The detective leaned forward. "I need to ask you something directly. Mr. Williams, do you believe you were targeted because of your race?" Robert had been thinking about this question for months. "Detective, I'm the only black homeowner on my street, and I'm the only one whose mailbox kept getting destroyed. Draw your own conclusions." Detective Reeves nodded. "That's what I thought. I'm going to recommend that the FBI take a look at this case. If we can prove this was racially motivated harassment, these men are looking at serious federal charges." 3 days after the crash, Robert received a phone call that made his week. It was from the insurance company representing Morrison's truck. "Mr. Williams, this is Jennifer Walsh from Apex Insurance. I'm calling about the incident involving your mailbox and our insured's vehicle." After reviewing the police report and the evidence you provided, we've determined that our insured was engaged in deliberate criminal activity when the accident occurred. We're denying coverage for the incident." Robert smiled. "What does that mean exactly?" "It means Mr. Morrison is personally responsible for all damages to his vehicle and medical expenses not covered by health insurance, and potentially liable for any damage to your property," Jennifer explained. "We're also notifying law enforcement that this appears to be insurance fraud, since Mr. Morrison initially claimed the crash was accidental." The dominoes continued to fall throughout the week. Linda Hartwell called an emergency HOA board meeting to discuss recent events, but the meeting turned into a revolt. Nearly 50 residents showed up, many of them carrying copies of Robert's security footage that had been quietly circulating through the neighborhood. Robert attended the meeting with his friend Tony and was amazed by what he saw. The same neighbors who had sat silently during his previous appearances were now standing up and demanding answers. One after another, they shared stories about harassment, selective enforcement, and intimidation tactics. Mrs. Patterson finally found her voice. "Linda, those men you hired told my husband that our American flag was hung incorrectly and threatened to fine us if we didn't take it down. When my husband asked to see the regulation they were citing, they told him to mind his own business or they'd find other violations." The Johnson family spoke about being told their teenage son's Honda Civic was inappropriate for the neighborhood character, and being pressured to make him park on the street instead of in their own driveway. An elderly couple named the Kowalskis revealed that Morrison had been taking photos of their house every week for months, claiming their lawn needed better maintenance even though their yard was immaculate. As story after story came out, it became clear that Linda Hartwell had been running Pine Valley Estates like her personal kingdom, using Morrison and Santos to intimidate anyone who challenged her authority or didn't fit her vision of the right kind of residence. The meeting ended with a unanimous vote of no confidence in Linda Hartwell and the current board. A new election was scheduled for the following month, and Linda was effectively stripped of her enforcement authority immediately, but the legal consequences were just beginning. A week after the crash, Dale Morrison and Rick Santos were formally charged with multiple felonies. The district attorney's office announced they were treating the case as a pattern of criminal harassment rather than isolated incidents. Morrison's family connections to the HOA leadership made everything worse for him legally. The prosecutor argued that he had used his position to systematically target a resident based on race, which elevated the charges to hate crime level. Santos, realizing he was facing serious prison time, decided to cooperate with prosecutors. In exchange for a reduced sentence, he provided detailed testimony about how Linda Hartwell had directed their harassment campaign and specifically instructed them to make Robert's life difficult until he got the message and moved away. The federal investigation that Detective Reeves had predicted became reality. FBI agents interviewed dozens of Pine Valley Estates residents and uncovered a pattern of discriminatory enforcement that went back several years. Linda Hartwell was arrested on federal civil rights violations and conspiracy charges. Robert's personal victory became a catalyst for much bigger changes. The Pine Valley Estates HOA was placed under court supervision, while new leadership was elected and new policies were implemented. The management company that had hired Morrison and Santos lost their contract and faced their own legal challenges. 6 months after the crash, Robert received a settlement offer from the HOA's insurance company that was large enough to pay off his mortgage completely. Rather than taking the money and staying quiet, Robert used part of it to establish a legal defense fund for other homeowners facing HOA harassment. His story went viral on social media, inspiring similar cases across the country. Robert received hundreds of messages from people who had faced comparable harassment from their own HOAs and didn't know how to fight back. Many of them used Robert's documentation methods and legal strategies to resolve their own situations. The engineering solution that had solved Robert's immediate problem became a symbol of something much larger. Other homeowners began reinforcing their own mailboxes, installing security cameras and standing up to HOA bullies with Robert's case as precedent. Morrison and Santos both received prison sentences. Morrison got 3 years in federal prison for the civil rights violations, plus additional time on the state charges. Santos got 18 months in exchange for his cooperation, but his testimony sealed the case against Linda Hartwell. Linda Hartwell was sentenced to 2 years in federal prison and banned from serving on any HOA board for life. The judge specifically noted that she had abused her position of trust to terrorize residents and undermine the civil rights protections that communities are supposed to provide. A year after the crash, Robert's mailbox still stood exactly where he had installed it. The neighborhood had transformed completely under new leadership. The enforcement tactics that had terrorized residents for years were replaced with fair, consistent policies applied equally to everyone. Robert became something of a neighborhood celebrity, but not in a way that made him uncomfortable. Children would point to his mailbox and ask their parents to tell them the story of how Mr. Williams stopped the bullies. Other residents often stopped by to thank him for having the courage to fight back when no one else would. The best part, though, was the simple pleasure of walking to his mailbox each day without worrying about whether it would still be there. Robert had protected more than just his property rights. He had protected his dignity, his family's safety, and his right to live peacefully in the home he had worked 30 years to afford. Sometimes the simplest solutions are the most effective. Robert had faced a complex problem involving racism, corruption, and abuse of power. His solution was elegantly simple: make the harassment stop working by removing the victim's vulnerability. But the real victory wasn't the engineering triumph of building an indestructible mailbox disguised as a standard one. The real victory was proving that regular people don't have to accept being bullied, even when the system seems designed to protect the bullies. Robert's mailbox stood as a monument to the principle that every person has the right to defend their home, their family, and their dignity. And sometimes the best defense is a good engineering solution that turns the aggressor's tactics against them. Pine Valley Estates became a better place for everyone because one man refused to be driven away from the home he had earned. Robert Williams had won more than a fight over a mailbox. He had won a victory for justice, equality, and the right of every person to live in peace.